stuff, so it's gonna be really fun. I remember a few years ago, I had this event happen in my life where there was lots of blood. I was with some friends. We were working in a church, and as we're working together, I'm cutting these cords. I had this big knife, and there were cords that had been like zip tied together, and my job was to go cut those cords to get them separated from one another once again. And so as I was going through and cutting these zip ties and cutting the cords, I ended up cutting each one of those, and then that knife that I was going through these zip ties with suddenly went right through my hand, and it went right into this webbing of between your thumb and your fingers, and went all the way through, coming out like almost poking through the other side. And as that happened, it was like a comic strip. Like it looked like a cartoon where suddenly there's blood just gushing out of my hand. Like literally just like as my heart would beat, you'd see a little bit more blood just gush out of there. It was really exciting. I was like, this is not good, you know? And like you don't know what to do at that moment. The knife's still stuck in my hand. I'm like, do I take it out? Do I leave it in? How do I handle the knife? And so I decided to take the knife out, which made I don't know if you know how this works, more blood. There's a lot more blood. There's blood everywhere at this point. Now there's blood not just in my hand, but now it's starting to squirt out of that area all over the ground. It's now starting to pool around me. There's like blood everywhere. I'm starting to get lightheaded at this point because there's so much blood, and I'm starting to like actually lose so much blood. So my friends that are with me, I'm like, hey guys, I need you to find, I don't know, if you can find like some gauze or some kind of bandage or something. They're like, yeah, we're on it. So they start running through this church building trying to find gauze. There's not any to be found, which is not safe for a church. They couldn't find anything. And so one friend comes back, and as I'm standing there, I'm elevating it, you know, like a professional, holding it over my head. I'm holding it tight with what I do have. And as my friend comes back, he comes back not with a Band-Aid, not with like Neosporin, not any gauze. He comes back with a Capri Sun. And he sits the Capri Sun at my feet. And he's like, and I was like, I look at him like, what's that for? He's like, well, I just thought maybe in case you got thirsty. And I was like, what? That's what you thought of. And then he just left. And I don't know if you know anything about Capri Suns. First of all, this isn't a useful help at this moment for what I'm dealing with. But secondly, you know how hard it is to put a straw into a Capri Sun when you have two working hands, let alone when you only have one? Like, I was like, this is the worst drink you could have brought me. This is the worst idea we could have had. And so he leaves it there, he runs away, and I'm now just sitting there with the Capri Sun with this over my head. I had to go to the hospital, we had to stitch it up. They had to put and they actually told me, they said, it's a good thing your friends didn't find the stuff. They finally found some stuff, they brought it to me. They said, we could put this in there. I didn't put it in, whatever this ointment was they found. And the doctors were like, it's a good thing you didn't put that in there, because that could have numbed your nerves for life. And they were like, so it's a good thing he didn't use that. And I was like, it's a good thing our friends are idiots. That's the good news I have. And so they stitched it up and they put it back together, and there was blood everywhere. Now, I told that story a few years ago, and the reason I told you that story this morning is to see how this went, because I told that story at a school a few years ago when I was speaking to high school, and it was about the uselessness of sacrifices that we see in the Old Testament. God actually says that sacrifices aren't necessary. And I told that story, and I kid you not, as I'm telling that story, a teacher raises her hand and says, can you stop for just a second? It was a huge auditorium of kids. Can you stop for just a second? I was like, sure. And one of the kids had flat out passed out. Like he was passed out because of the blood story. And they were like, it was too much. So I just wanted to see how everybody did. And all of you passed. We're all okay, I think. So we're going to move into this bit about sacrifice. Because this morning, as we start to understand this, we are going to talk about 5 forms of sacrifice. We're not going to get to every single one of them, but there are 5 forms of sacrifice that happen right at the beginning of Leviticus. And if you've read through Leviticus before, you know it gets graphic, and there's lots of blood and guts and all kinds of, like, how you can chop up an animal, and the right way to chop it up, the wrong way to chop it up, what part goes to who, all kinds of gross stuff. We're going to get into all of that in a second, but we kind of have to understand why this happens. Like, what is it about this, and who does this, and a lot of different things, because reading Leviticus by itself is so hard to do. If you've ever done it, we talked about it last week, it is difficult to get through. Because sometimes I don't think we have the context, we don't have the understanding. I'm not saying I can solve all of that, because I'll be honest, I have read commentaries over the last couple of weeks, especially, that are from some rabbis who will flat out tell you there are parts of Exodus that we just don't know why they happen. Like, they'll just be like, we don't know. We don't know. This thing, why this is this way and why that's that way, we really just can't tell you. And so some of it's just ancient practice, some of it's things we have to kind of that we'll just have to kind of set to the side. But there are some things that we can learn from. And there's some things that I think still speak to who we are today, the things we deal with now. Now, if you remember last week, and if you have your Bible, if you want to turn to Leviticus 1, we're just going to be walking kind of through those first few chapters. But Leviticus 1, again, as Jamie read for us, or as Tammy read for us, right there at the beginning, you have this first verse that we talked about last week at length. And again, we only made it through one verse last week of Leviticus. So this series is going to take us roughly the next 12 to 18 years. So like just stick in there, it's going to be great. We made it through one verse last week. I promise we'll make it through more today. But that first verse is so critical. And I just want to go back through that just to make sure that we all are on the same page. Again, that first verse, it says, "The Lord called to Moses, and he spoke to him from the tent of meeting." So a few things that we have to understand. Again, remember that first word there, the Lord called, is this word vayakra, right? Vayakra is a word that means to call or to continue calling. It's a continued call from Exodus to what's happening now. There's a continual call that's happening on Moses' life. Remember that God finds Moses in the desert, and he says, I want you to not just liberate yourself, but I want you to liberate all these slaves who've been living in slavery for 400 years. And he calls them, in fact, some rabbis, by the way, if you don't know this, Leviticus is one name for this book. It's one name for the book. The book we know is called Leviticus. And that's because the Levites, if you're not familiar with this, it's the priest. It's the priestly line of the 12 tribes. The Levites were the priests. This book is actually written to the priests. It's not written to everybody. It's written for how the priests should act and how they should conduct the rest of their religious ceremonies for the entire people. But actually in a lot of ancient tradition, and many rabbis still write that this book is actually not called Leviticus to them. This book is called Calling. This book is called The Calling. That's what it was, because it was a calling of God to Moses saying, come into this tent of meeting. Now you see in that same verse, it says he calls him from the tent. That tent is what's going to be called the tabernacle, right? Where God is going to have his presence dwell in this tabernacle where we will see the meeting of heaven and earth. It's the place where heaven and earth come back together. Just like we saw in the garden, remember from last week, in the Garden of Eden is where heaven and earth once met. And there was sin that broke those two things apart. And this sin and this shame broke those two things, the heaven and the earth, they got separated. But God, through those 7 days of creation, we see him recreate things here in the temple where he does 7 acts of creation in the book of Exodus to recreate the temple to say, let's set things back to right. Let's set things the way they were. And that number 7 shows up over and over again through the book of Leviticus. We'll get to it in just a second. But it shows up over and over again to show us that God is setting things back to original creation. And he's doing it through his people and through his tabernacle, through his church, where his people dwell with him in harmony and unity with him, just like the garden. So he's setting all this up in that first verse, from the tent. But remember, it's from the tent. He calls him from the tent. They're not in the tent together. They are, because Moses can't enter the tent yet until all of Leviticus is understood. He's not allowed to come in. This whole book, actually, if you pay attention to how the whole Pentateuch works, the beginning of Exodus is God calling Moses. The beginning of Leviticus is God calling Moses into the tent. Then the beginning of Deuteronomy is Moses entering, actually being inside the tent. It's like this progression of moving things into this tabernacle. And so he's calling him from because there's some things they have to get in order for them to be in unity with one another. And one of the biggest things is they have to learn how to live with one another. How do we know what God wants from us? How do we know what to do with the sin and the shame that we bear? How do we know what God's preparing us for in the future? What does that look like? And so the book of Leviticus actually lays this out. We didn't talk about this last week, but in the book of Leviticus, just so you know where we're going over the next few weeks, is the layout of Leviticus, if I could give you that, is in these separate chapters. This is kind of the separate ways that people break this out. And it's pretty understandable if you pay attention to it. But you'll see there's ritual sacrifices, there's a priestly ordination, there's a ritual purity, there's a day of atonement right in the middle. Now, what you'll notice is Leviticus actually written with some symmetry, which is really cool. So notice like the top and the bottom. Do you see those two? Ritual sacrifices, ritual feasts. Notice these rituals are on the outer edges of this. Then you move in, and there's a priestly ordination and a priestly qualification. That moves us in a little bit closer to understanding what Leviticus is about. There's a symmetry to this. Then there's ritual purity and moral purity. Do you see that? There's a symbolism where these things are paralleling one another. Ritual purity, moral purity, all about purity, which leads us to the center of the book, which is the most important part of the book, which leads us to this day of atonement. Everything centers around that. That's the middle of the book because everything is really, that is the center of the book and the center of understanding of everything that's to come, is there is a day of atonement that is coming for us. Now, just fun fact, just in case you're a Bible nerd and you're really bored and you have a lot of free time like I do, one of the cool things about this is the ritual sacrifices, just so you know how many ritual sacrifices there are? Oh, there's 5. Not quite as many as you might think. But in each one of those 5, there are 7 commands for how you sacrifice. Or if you want to know how the priestly ordination works, just so you know, there's 7 acts of ordination. Or if you want to know how the purifications work, there are 7 different purifications. And it all leads to a 7-day festival of the Day of Atonement. It's almost like God has some kind of plan in this whole thing. I can't tell you where it is. I can't figure it out myself. But just hear me out. It sounds like we're moving towards something where all of creation is being restored through what God is doing in the book of Leviticus. There's so much going on here. We don't have time to get into like every little detail, but it's fascinating that this book has so much density and so much depth that we don't always understand. But if I was to sum up what these sacrifices are for, because you might be like, okay, so we have these sacrifices beginning and end. We're only going to look at the first 7 chapters, by the way. We're only going to and we're not going through all 7 chapters. Like if you're like, oh no, no, we're not going. We'll just kind of skip through a few of these. But in this piece of sacrifice, if you're like, what is a sacrifice for? How does this work? If I was to sum up what I've been reading and understanding about this, is these sacrifices, they teach the slaves how to deal with their shame. If I could give you just one sentence, and we'll talk about what this means in a second. But to teach these slaves how to deal with their shame. Because these folks, remember, they're coming out of slavery. They've been in slavery for 400 years. I mean, think about that for just a second, how long that is. Right? America has only been around for, 250 years? What are we doing, 350? Like, we're not doing great. Think about how much we've learned, though, over that time of just how we operate. How much a culture has been put into our bodies from families and generations, and the way we've been taught and the way we've learned things. We have a culture that's been taught to us and put in us, maybe more caught than taught, but it's in us. Think about that for 400 years, seeing your father and grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather living in slavery day after day. It takes a toll. And God pulls these slaves out of Egypt and says, you're no longer in slavery, but guess what? You may not be in Egypt, but Egypt is still very much in you. It's still there. It's hard to get rid of that. And so when he pulls them out, he has to teach them how to deal with this, specifically, not just their freedom, although they are free. He has to teach them what it looks like to be free and how to act in freedom and how to live as a free person and a free people under him. But then he also has to teach them how to deal with like this other thing. Because I don't know about you, I think every single one of us, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're a better person than I am, and maybe this is just me projecting on other people. But I feel like all of us carry some form or some weight of shame in our lives. Like just on a daily basis, we have shame in our lives. I just think that we generally have something with us where we feel defensive, because we kind of feel like we're always just a little bit on edge because we have to defend ourselves, because we know we've done something wrong, or because we think maybe we don't even know what we've done wrong. We'll get to that later. There's things like that. Like I think there's a part of us that lives in this form of shame. I just think we have it. Have you ever seen that? Like, again, I've mentioned before that I know I operate out of shame a lot. And I notice it when my value starts to change. I've mentioned this before, but I remember I had a therapist who once told me this, that it's when this changes the most for me, is that when I don't hear a statement as a statement, but I hear it as a value statement. That's when I'm living in a place of shame. So again, I've mentioned before, like when Marie will say something to me and she's not meaning any harm by it. She can come into the house, and I've literally had this happen before. I mean, not long ago, we were at the house and she mentioned something about the yard needing to be mowed. That's a statement. That's a fact. It needed to be mowed. That's what wasn't like there was no arguing that. It needed to be mowed. That's what she said. What did I hear? I heard, man, Kevin's really lazy. Like, why aren't you doing what you need to do? Right? Why are you too busy working all the time? You're not taking care of the house. And then it spirals into, and you're not around enough, probably with the family. And you're not doing enough around here. You're not pulling your weight. Anybody ever have this happen? Am I the only one? I'm the only one. It spirals from there too, right? Why? Because I think we're all carrying some level of shame. I just think we do. I don't think we're meant to, but I think it's a byproduct of sin. It comes with sin. It just shows up after that. Brene Brown, who studies shame, she is a researcher on shame. She has one of the most watched TED Talks of all time, and it's about shame, which is wild. And she talks about this, but in one of her books, she says, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed, and therefore we are unworthy of love and belonging. See, the greater fear of shame is not just that we did something wrong, it's that because we did something wrong, we're no longer a part of a relationship anymore. We're not worthy of that. We're going to be cut out of that. I think a lot of us live in this mode all the time. We're terrified that this shame is going to find us out and we're going to be cut out of relationship. This doesn't just happen. This isn't just Brene Brown writing about this. Look at what happens in the book of Genesis, right? There's this beginning in Genesis where it says in Genesis 2, it says Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame, which some people still don't feel that shame. I don't know if you've been around Florida lately, but there's some people, they still don't have that shame. It's amazing. It's wild. But they were naked and they felt no shame. They were just living their lives. And then sin enters the world. Sin enters through this decision that they've made, and suddenly with sin comes shame. In the NLT, it's translated this way, but it says, at that moment in Genesis 3, their eyes were open and suddenly they felt what? Shame. This is the first time shame shows up in the Bible, because there was no shame before there was sin. But with sin comes shame, and now they felt their nakedness. Now there was shame. And so they sewed these fig leaves together. Why? To cover themselves. They had to find a way to cover their sin and their shame. They had to put something over themselves to cover that. And man, we all wear those fig leaves today, don't we? We're all finding ways to try to cover our shame. Whether it's with the job, whether it's with the title, whether it's with the nice house, whatever it is, we'll find a way to cover that shame. We're all working on it all day long, every day, which is living by the words of the Bible, which is living not in freedom. That's living in slavery. But we're all trying to find that same way of doing things. Now here's what Brene Brown goes on to say about shame, just a couple things. She says, shame is the fear of disconnection, and it's basically the fear of being unlovable. Why? Because you know yourself and you know the shame you carry. And what happens a lot at times like this is in a book like Leviticus, and at a time especially like what the Israelites were experiencing, they would have been experiencing a time where there was a lot of questions about how does God really feel about us? Gods were not known to be very present or very active. Gods were known to be distant deities who stayed at a distance on purpose and kept you at arm's length. And so there's a lot of questions about, I have this shame. What do I do with that? Is God going to accept me with the shame that I carry, or am I going to be cut out of this relationship, just like Adam and Eve were afraid they would be? Or am I going to have to cover up for God? You have to put on more stuff to make God impressed with me? What does it take for God to notice? Where do I stand with him? I mean, even just yesterday, I was with a family who has a member who is going to pass away any day now, at the end of life. And as I'm with them, I'm sitting and we're talking for about an hour and a half in a driveway, and this question comes up for somebody, and I promise you, this person, great person, I could tell you where they stand with God from my point of view. Everything's amazing. This is a great person, incredible heart for Jesus, loves Jesus, spent his entire life learning to love and follow Jesus. And yet this question comes up of where does he really stand? Like, is God cool with them? Is this going to work out the way we thought it would? And you start to have these questions again. We all still ask the same questions that they were asking then. Don't act like this is some ancient problem. but they just dealt with it maybe a little bit differently than we did. Because we're all still wondering, where do we stand with this God? Does this God actually love us? Or do we have to put on more fig leaves for him to accept us? What kind of God is this? And that's what they're wondering at this time. That's what we're wondering today. And part of the reason we're so disconnected from understanding God is actually, in understanding the way they thought about God especially, is because we're very disconnected, not just from God, but we're very disconnected from the earth. Here's what I mean by that. We don't understand how maybe folks in Leviticus thought the Israelites were thinking, because we don't understand kind of how the earth works at the same level. Yesterday I was with Marie and I were at Wawa. It's like a really fancy place. I don't know if you've ever been there. They have a restaurant, and so we were at I know how to treat a lady right. And so we're at the Wawa. We ordered the subs right on the screen, and because we were in a hurry, and so we do that. And she ordered this wrap, and it had this dill pickle dressing on it, and it was seasonal. And we got in the car, and she's like, "This is one of the best wraps I've ever had." And I said, "You're welcome. Don't forget what I've done for you here." And she goes, "I'm just so sad that dressing's seasonal. Why do you think it's seasonal?" And I was like, "Because obviously you can't grow pickles just year round. That's the thing. They're a seasonal vegetable? Question mark? I think they're a vegetable. Now here's what I mean by that. Here's where I'm going with that. Is I think that I've spent time. I don't know if you have. I remember a few years ago. It was Christmas time. And I was making salsa for people because I'm cheap and that's my present. And I also make a really good salsa. And so I was like, I'm gonna make salsa for a bunch of people. I'll hand it out to people. It'll be great. And I went to I went to a really great grocery store because it was the only one open. And it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I went to Walmart. Which, have you ever gone to Walmart at 1 a.m. in Christmas season, especially? Oh boy, especially just the workers. It is the Walking Dead in there. You're like, you feel so bad for them. You've been through, this is what hell will be like, I think. This is it. This is what I imagine hell to be. And so I'm walking through, and I start picking up vegetables. I'm picking up, groceries. I'm getting the tomatoes and the jalapenos and the onions, and I'm putting them all in my cart, and I'm walking out with those. And it hit me, as weird as it is, at that moment, how off that is. Because I don't know if you know how this works, but I have family that works in agriculture. They work a farm up in Oklahoma, and this would be wild for them 100 years ago. This would have never happened. Because why? Tomatoes only grow at certain times of the year. You can't just walk in any time of the year and get a tomato. There were times that you could get a tomato. Or even me walking into a store at 1 a.m. would not happen. There's not lights. There's not a place for you to do that. These tomatoes could not have been kept overnight and be kept good for that long. There's all kinds of things. We are out of touch with what the earth really does, if that makes sense, because I can go get tomatoes at any time I want. The reality is that's not how the earth works or has always worked. We're so out of touch with that, we don't really understand it anymore. But there was a time, think about this for a second, in the book Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari talks about this a lot, how we learned to farm land. And when we learned to tame the land actually tamed us. And what he's saying is, when we started to farm on this land, we started to get so ingrained into that's where our food came from. We were no longer nomadic. We weren't following herds, and we weren't following animals around. We were staying put, and we had to farm what we got. When we started doing that, I don't know if you know how farming works. I'm not a great gardener. I'm not really good at this stuff. Again, I told you last week I planted 2 different seeds of grass in my yard like an idiot. I mean, that's how I'm living my life. Against all Levitical law, I have 2 different forms of grass in my front yard. I'm not good at this. However, here's what I do know, is you need sun and you need water to grow those crops. And most people at this time, especially in ancient Near East especially, people were struggling to grow crops. And so what you had is you had the sun and you had the water. And if the sun didn't come out enough, you didn't have a plant. Or if it came out too much, you didn't have your plants. And if you had not enough water, you wouldn't have plants. Or if it was too much water, you wouldn't have plants. Droughts or floods or whatever might happen, you would have too much or not enough. And so you started getting worried that there was a God who must control these things. That's why every culture in the world had a sun god and some form of a god of water. Because those 2 things had to happen, and they had to happen at the right amounts. And if they didn't happen at the right amounts, guess what? You didn't eat. You didn't have food. You went hungry. And so you'd start praying to these gods, being like, gods, what do I need to do to make you happy? How do I know if I'm in good standing with you? And there was no way to know because the weather patterns were unpredictable. And so you're just throwing things out, hoping that gods would pay attention to you. This is why we see in the book, when we see in 2 Kings, where Elijah talks to people who are cutting themselves. Remember this? The prophets of Baal. They're cutting themselves, trying to get their God to pay attention to them because they don't know how else to know if they're in good standing or bad standing with their God. There's no way to know. Unless the crops grow, we don't know if God likes us or if he hates us. We don't know where he's at. We don't know how to appease him or please him. We don't know what to do with these things. And so people were struggling with this over and over again. That was hard for them. And so that's where we get into the crazy stuff, like people sacrificing not just themselves and not just animals and not just crops, but starting to sacrifice their own children, which was a common practice at this time, where people were sacrificing their own children because they didn't know how else to please a God. They were trying to figure it out. There's multiple writings. I don't have to walk you through all of them, but there are so many writings in this. I mean, I believe there's some that you'll see in in Deuteronomy. There's a passage. Where is it in Deuteronomy? I think it's in 12. Deuteronomy 12, there's a passage that talks about this, that there's, oh, you have it. Okay, great. Because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things. Notice this, they even burn their sons and daughters. This is the prophets of Baal. People are trying to figure out how to make a God happy. This happens in Jeremiah too. Later on in Jeremiah, we see that he says they built high places of Baal to burn their children in fire as offering. Like they're trying to figure out, how do you make a God happy? And as crazy as that sounds, it's a real question. And it may sound terrible. I mean, and I could go, there's a few other historians I think I threw in here that we don't have to go through, but in the 400 BC era, we see one historian, we see a few different ones. It doesn't really matter, but there are lots of different things. Kronos, by the way, was a god of Baal's god. And notice this, this is a statue. Its hands extend over a bronze brazier, and then the flames engulf the child, the flames upon the body, the limbs contract and open the mouth. It's all kinds of stuff about this. Thus, there's a grin, known as sardonic laughter, because they die laughing. The child dies laughing. This is stuff that was happening at this time, that people were sacrificing kids because they didn't know how to make God happy. They didn't know how many more fig leaves to put on or what they needed to do, what kind of production to do to make God happy. And so as slaves, all they knew was how to produce more to make God happy. Think about that for a second, but as a slave, your production was your value. How many bricks you made was literally your value to humanity. That's how they operated. And so they thought, how much more can I produce to make God happy with me? How much more can I give to make God happy with me? What is it going to take from me? And if you think that that's far-fetched for us today, I would challenge that that's almost exactly where we live. We may not be giving up our children to another God, but we are giving ourselves fully to other gods. Say, how much more can I produce to make myself not feel the shame that I feel? How many more fig leaves can I create and sew together to make it feel like I'm not having the shame that I'm carrying every single day? What else can I do? How much more can I produce? I think it's one of the biggest drivers of our culture is that shame piece. But it makes us produce things because we think that's our entire value. I mentioned the other day in another teaching, but just one of the Vatican's writings from January 25, where they, and here in 2025, they had written this piece from the Vatican, specifically talking about this in the encyclical, where they had written about how we deal with this right now. And again, I won't read the whole thing, but there's one paragraph I do want you to see that I thought was brilliant. They said, drawing an overly close equivalence between the human intelligence and AI, like the production of us, it risks succumbing to functionalist perspective, where people are valued based on the work they can perform. However, a person's worth does not depend on possessing specific skills, cognitive or technological achievements, or individual success, but on the person's inherent dignity grounded in being created in the image of God. I don't care if you're a Catholic or not, that's good. That's really good. Because we're still living in that culture, aren't we? How much can you produce? That's your value. How much can you do? That's your value. And so when God shows up and does the sacrificial system, it's actually different than that. I know it doesn't sound like it is off the top, but it's different than that. He wants these people to see themselves as people in freedom, no longer being slaves to those things. Now, here's the problem, is he can't just jump to the end and say, here's Jesus. I think that God, if you're reading the Bible through this lens, he can't just say, well, let me get you to the Savior at the end of it all. There are steps he has to take to prepare us for that. I don't think at this moment that humanity was ready for that. The Israelites are not ready for what that looks like, that kind of freedom. And so God's kind of creating this lens by which we will see the Savior, but we're not going to be part of that yet. And so he sets up this sacrificial system as a training ground for that. I don't know if you have any kids right now, or if you're about to have kids, or you've had kids who have had their permit for a little bit, like their driver's permit. That's a terrifying situation. We're like a year out from that, and I'm fine if we never do that. I'm fine if she knows how to ride a bike. I think that's enough. I don't see why we're doing this to ourselves, I think that's great. We were having this conversation the other day. There was a kid here in the church. He's since moved actually to Hawaii. But there was a kid here in the church. He got his permit, and his mom asked me if I would help him learn to drive. And I was like, sure, you bet. And so I went to his house to help on a Sunday afternoon, and I pulled up in my car, and he was like, do you mind if I try in your car? And I was like, that's totally fine. At that time, I had a big SUV. He'd been learning in his mom's little Mini Cooper, and I had this big SUV, and he was like, do you mind if I try your car instead? I was like, that's totally fine, no problem. So he gets in, he backs out of the driveway, immediately goes, I think I just hit the mailbox. And yes, he did. It was one of those rubber ones, and it bounced up, and it was doing this. And he did it first thing. And I was like, this is going to be a great day. Everything's going to go fantastic. And so that was our first experience. Because we have to learn these things. We're not ready for the whole thing. And what God's doing here is he's setting up this story that's going to play out over time that will lead us to that. But these sacrifices in the system is setting us up for where we're going with that. It's not all in one fix, but it does help us to learn, what do we do with that shame? And what do we do as slaves? How do we learn to be free in this culture? What does that look like for us to be free in the midst of this? And so there's kind of three things, if I was to give you, this is what it sets us up for. It sets us up for these three different pieces here. It sets us up for recognition. There's a recognition that will come with this. It's going to set us up for readiness, that there's a readiness to being ready for and getting ready for what's to come with Jesus. And then there's also a righteousness. Not just a righteousness with us and God, but a righteousness of us and other people. That's what these will do for us. And so if you go back to verses 1 and 2, if you want to go back to verses 1 and 2 here, I want you to see where this comes in, okay? So it says this, again, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. And we'll get to that in a second. But that word offering is actually a really interesting word because it doesn't mean what we think it means, where it's like something you give. It's the word korban in the Hebrew. And korban means, yes, sacrifice is how we translate it, but actually the word is a verb, and it means drawing near. You see, the sacrifice, the thing we give, is this thing that pulls us closer to God himself. It's not just an action. It's not just something we have to do or something we give. It's something that pulls us closer to being more like God and closer to God. That's what these do. And so they set us up for that recognition. They set us up for this readiness, and they set us up for righteousness. When we give these sacrifices, the goal is that they pull us closer to a recognition of God, a readiness for what's to come, and a righteousness with God and with others at the same time. So it goes on from there, and I'm going to start reading the gory part, and I promise we'll kind of skip through some of these because we can't get to every single sacrifice. But I do want you to see this first one. This is a burnt offering sacrifice in chapter 1. If you have your Bible open, we're going to read straight through chapter 1 here, okay? It's going to get gross. But here we go. It says this. This is the olah, by the way. The olah was what this was called in the burnt offering. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. Okay, so and the reason you're going to see a lot of without defect is there's a little bit of regifting here, where God's like, you know what I'm talking about, right? Where it's like you got that. I don't know, that like weird ice cream maker that you're like, I'm never going to use this. I'll just go buy ice cream at the store like a human or whatever. And you're like, I'll just give this to the next person. That's what is happening here. Is kind of like, no, I want the one that's good. I don't want you just giving up stuff that's junk. But you're going to find a male without defect. Also, I read one commentary that literally said, usually, not all of the time, usually these are males. Usually the offering is a male. And the quote exactly, I think, from that author was, because males are more expendable. You do with that what you will, ladies. Okay? Males are more expendable. So there you have it. You can use that whenever you need to. But it says, you must present it at the entrance of the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You're to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, right? So these priests, these Aaron's sons are the priests at this time. They'll come in, and they'll bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance of the tent of meetings. You're to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priests, are to put fire to the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the wood, and it will burn against the altar. You are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water. And the priest is to burn off all of the altar. Burn it all on the altar, And it is a burnt offering, a food offering, and it's an aroma pleasing to the Lord. It's an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Now hang on to that. Doesn't that sound fun, by the way? If you guys were coming to church today with your animals, I'm so glad that pastor roles have changed, if I'm being honest with you. I don't think I could do that job. I don't think that's the job I'd want as a pastor, is like, bring me your animals. I'll do the skinning, and I'm happy to burn them up for you and cut out their fat and then splash the blood on the sides. Now, a lot of people believe, just a quick side note, a lot of people believe that the splashing of the blood around the altar and around the area is actually kind of a cool symbol that happens through a lot of this, because there's a belief in the Hebrew culture that when you and I sin, there is the sin that happens between us, right? I hurt you, right? And I may sin against you. And when I do that, it may be between us, but if you don't know anything about how sin works or just how humans work, it's never really just between us, is it? There's always a domino effect. Other people get hurt, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because hurt people, or because the thing I did, because of the rift between us, I've now created a bigger problem in the community or whatever. These are to create a cleanliness of the entire space, not just between two people, not just between you and God, but between you and the entire community. That righteousness in this sense is not just between us and God, it's between us and everyone else as well. But this part right here is really about this recognition of God, because I want you to see the next part of recognition. So then, secondly, notice this. If the offering is a burnt offering from the flock, which is different, notice the first section was a herd. Second section is the flock. From either a sheep or the goats, you were to offer a male without defect. You were to slaughter at the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall splash blood against the sides of the altar. You were to cut it into pieces. The priest shall arrange them, including the head and the fat, on the wood that is burning on the altar. You were to wash the internal organs and the legs with water, and the priest is to bring all of them and burn them on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering. Notice this again. An aroma pleasing to the Lord. Second time we've seen that. Now the third section, so we saw that there's been a flock, or there's been a herd first, then there was a flock. Now we're going to move down to birds. It says, if an offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, you were to offer a dove or a young pigeon. The priest shall bring it to the altar, and the priest is going to wring off the head. Again, so glad I'm not doing that today. And burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out of the side of the altar. He is to remove the crop and the feathers and throw them down east of where the altar and the ashes are. He'll tear it open by the wings, not dividing it completely, and then the priest shall burn it on the wood that is burning on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, and notice this again, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. A couple quick things. First of all, I want you to notice that there is this idea in this that that there is a recognition happening here. I guess there's two things I want you to see. One is that God tells us where we stand with him in this. No other God had done this at this time. He says, if you do this, what does he say? It's an aroma pleasing to the Lord. You'll actually know where you stand with this God. He's not going to just make you anxious and worried about it. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels about it. But you're not earning anything, because I want you to see something. In any of those, did you ever catch, and we're at the beginning of the book, did you ever catch a point where it said, listen, God's real mad at you, so you need to bring an offering to make him happy? Did anybody see that part? It was like, God hates your guts, and so you need to bring other guts to make him happy. Anybody see that part? It's not in there. One of the problems we have is we have this assumption that this is to somehow appease a God who's mad at us, these sacrifices. That's not the case. It's not to appease a God, it is to appreciate that God. Think about this for a second, but God is reminding them, he's the God who just brought you out of slavery. If you want to appreciate that God, if you want to recognize that God, if you want to give him the recognition he deserves, here's a way you can do that. He's giving you an avenue for gratitude. He's giving you this avenue to say, if you have gratitude in your heart, here's a way you can express it. I know it's not the way you and I would express it, but he is saying, at this time, in this culture, if you want to thank God for what he's done, here's how you can thank him. See, I think so many times we think that when we read stuff like this, it's because God's mad at us and we just got to do what we can to appease him. That's the ancient way of thinking of other gods, not this God. He's not asking because he needs it. He's not asking because even he requires it of us. It's not a requirement. This is because we are able to show him our gratitude for what he's done for us. And I just want, and really quickly, just a quick other side note maybe, is that, and I was thinking about this morning, which probably not a good idea to think about this like last minute, but I was thinking about this a little bit. It is interesting that all these get burned up. Did you notice that? All of them get burned up. What happens a lot of times, we get afraid, especially institutionally, with being generous to the church, because we're like, we don't want to give to institutions anymore. So if it talks about tithing or we talk about giving money to a church, we don't trust institutions. This wasn't the same as that, because at the end of the day, did the church get richer off of these animals? No. It all went up in flames. It was all given to God in his glory. And that's, honestly, if you are tithing, that's our hope for you in the church, is that you're giving to something that gives God glory over and over again, not just something that creates its own empire or kingdom or makes itself wealthier, but something that actually gives God glory in everything that's happening. They're not enriching themselves. They're not paying the priests with this money. We will get to that later. But what they're doing is they're just giving this to God. This is an offering that they all take part in. And so it's interesting that they do this not to appease a God, but to appreciate that God, to recognize who he is. But the second thing is, notice that there's not one size for this. And this is just interesting to me. That first section said that there was a herd, then there was a flock, and then there were birds. Now, the herd would mean like a cow or an ox. Those are in herds. The flock would be like a sheep or a goat. So a little bit less expensive, a little bit less of a sacrifice in a way. And then the smallest would be the birds. And at this time, it's believed that you could literally just walk outside and grab a bird if you knew what you were doing. Like, birds were everywhere. They were not hard to find. And kind of like now. Right? It's not hard to find a bird. And if you need to, just wash your car and they'll find you. So like, just don't worry about it too hard. You'll find a bird. But that was kind of the belief of these, is that you had different sizes of sacrifice. Now, some people believe that's because there was already, by the way, there was already a hierarchy starting of wealth, which is wild. They just came out of slavery and now they're already starting to divide up in wealth. However, most people believe it was because it was up to you how much you brought. It was up to you how much you wanted to sacrifice. And I'll just say, like, it happens a lot in worship today. When we come to appreciate God, there's some of us that, and I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. Listen, I was brought up in the church where, like, when we would worship, if I raised one hand, that was wild stuff. If like one hand went up, and so you'd kind of do this like side thing where you'd kind of put one hand out as calmly as you could, but like you didn't want to make ruffle feathers with that. just make everybody happy. Some of you worship, it's hands up, it's spread out, it's, there's kneeling or there's, whatever it might be. That's amazing. Not one's right or one's wrong. However, when we worship, we still kind of do the same thing. It's not one size fits all. And that's okay. But we still worship the same way, where we come in and we give out of appreciation to our God, and we show him our gratitude through worship. It's still something we do today. So there's not this one size fits all to that, but I want you to kind of keep moving with me here, okay? So the next thing I want you to see is not the recognition, but the readiness. These sacrifices are setting them up for readiness, to be ready for what's to come. The next offering, chapter 2, if you have your Bible open, chapter 2. This is the mincha, is what it would be called, the mincha, which was the meal. It was a food offering that would happen. And the food offering, by the way, one of these this grain offering is sometimes called the cereal offering, which is pretty great. Yeah, so it's like some of you give the cereal offering every day. I don't know. Some of you are like, man, the honey bunches of oats is my normal offering. But it says, when anyone brings a grain offering to the Lord, their offering is to be full of, here's a few things that they give us: the finest flour. They are to pour olive oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest shall take a handful of flour and oil, together with all the incense, and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar. A food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Again, aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offering presented to the Lord. Now you'll see in some of this, and I'm sorry, I know this is like a little bit maybe too text heavy or maybe too much like scholarly. But again, like you'll see in this, just when you read through Leviticus, if you read through Leviticus, you'll find there's repetition. Like if you saw that in that chapter, there's a little bit of repetition to what's happening there. It's believed that some of Leviticus was actually written to be a song, so that you could remind yourself as you were making your bread how to make your bread. Or as you were like, I don't know, murdering a bull. Here's how you murder a bull. I don't know. I can't imagine singing during that part where it's just like a whistle while you work, while you're cutting up a lamb. But I don't know. It's not my life. But like it was written to be a song, so you would remind yourself over and over again. So some of this is actually written as Hebrew poetry to remind you over and over again. So there's kind of this repetition you'll see in there. What I want you to see in this is that there are these three ingredients. And a lot of scholars believe this was intentional. So it says your finest flour. Now that doesn't mean like your best flour. What it means is your most ground up flour, right? You took flour and you crushed it. You crushed it over and over again. Then you take olive oil, which is only olive oil when you've crushed the olives, right? And then you take incense, which incense only becomes aroma or anything fragrant when it is crushed. There's this belief that it was showing us that these little tiny details matter. Every little thing matters. And it's setting us up for what's to come. That's what is happening here. Like it's setting us up for what will happen later. Like when Isaiah would write in Isaiah 53, right? That he's pierced for our transgressions and he was crushed for our iniquities. Right? We're starting to see what it's going to look like in the coming kingdom and with the coming king. And we're being set up for this thing that every detail of your life will now matter to this coming kingdom. I have a friend he was a Navy SEAL for a number of years, and he was the first 5-star SEAL ever awarded that honor. It only went to 4 stars for a number of years. He lived in Virginia Beach. I remember talking to him one time. He said, "You know the first thing you learn when you're a SEAL?" And I said, and I was like excited to find out. He said, "No." And I was like, "So you probably swim in the ocean or something, or you like murder somebody, or you like I don't know what you do first day. Like, do you get a knife? Do you get to go do stuff with knives or guns?" He's like, "No, you don't do any of that." I was like, "What do you do? Do you swim in the ocean?" He's like, "No, I don't swim in the ocean." "Do you do the parachuting stuff?" "Nope, no parachuting." First thing you learn as a Navy SEAL is you learn how to make your bed. I was like, "Well, that's a big letdown." To be honest with you, that's housekeeping, bro. And he was like, "You learn how to make your bed, and then you get your hair cut a certain way. You learn how your clothes are supposed to look. You learn how to shine your boots. Every detail matters. Why? Because every detail of your life, they want you thinking about how you are in service of something greater than yourself. There's a service that you are getting ready for. Every detail matters to get you ready for that thing. Many people believe a lot of these sacrifices are readying the Israelites for what is to come that they'll never see in their lifetime, but what is to come, and making their hearts ready for that thing, that it will eventually happen. Last thing I just want you to see is in chapter 4. We won't spend a lot of time on this. In chapter 4, just so you know, there's this sin offering that happens. I just want you to see this again. As we talk about this a little bit, this is where the righteousness comes in. Not just righteousness with God, righteousness with others. I love what it says here, and I'm not going to, again, spend a ton of time on this. But it says, if you notice verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in the Lord's commands. And this word here, the Hebrew word for unintentionally is shagaga, and I love that word. Anyways, doesn't matter. Shagaga. He says, even if it's unintentionally that they are sinning, that they should know that they are sinning. And somebody needs to call them out on that. They need to be aware of the sin that they've created. I don't know about you, there's a lot of sins I think that happen unintentionally. Even those unintentional sins are given space in this. And they're supposed to come together and have this sacrifice that they give. Then over in verse 13, it says the same thing. If the whole Israelite community sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in the Lord's commands, even though the community is unaware of the matter, when they realize their guilt, right, then they're going to come and they're going to give this sacrifice. So the same thing in verse 22. When a leader sins unintentionally, does what is forbidden in the Lord's commands, when he realizes his guilt, notice this, leaders aren't let off scot-free. Leaders have to come and apologize to their community as well. They are not above this law, and they are not above their community. They are part of the community, and therefore even they, when they sin, even unintentionally, somebody gets to call them out, and they will come together when they realize their guilt. And the sin that's been committed, it will become known, and he must bring an offering of a male goat without defect. All these different things are going to happen over and over again. As Alistair Begg says, the Scottish theologian, he says, our relationship with God will never be right as long as our relationship with others is wrong. We're not going to be in righteousness with God if we're not in right standing with each other. We have to live in this righteousness, and so there's even a symbol for that as well. Now, what would happen is all 5 of these different things, I'm not going to go through the rest of the different sacrifices, but all 5 of these sacrifices would happen. All 5 of them would take place, and when they would take place, finally the priests would come out of the tent, and they would say to everybody that it was finished, that we did it, that it's over, that it was finished. And you might be wondering, if you're like me, you're like, but why does God need us to do this? Like, why does God need us to go kill animals? What's the point of this? What is this doing for God? Have you ever wondered that? I've wondered that as I've read through this. Why does God need this? Again, what we realize as we read through this is that this was never for him. I mean, Psalm 50 would tell us, in Psalm 50, just a few verses of it, but it tells us that this isn't for God. It says, listen, my people, I'll speak. I'll testify against you, Israel. I'm God, your God. And guess what God says? I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offering, which are ever before me. I have no need of a bull from your stall or goats from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, the insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world is mine and all that's in it. Do I eat the flesh of the bulls or drink the blood of the goats? Like, I don't need what you're offering. This isn't for him. I mean, he goes on and says this later on in Hebrews. The author of Hebrews goes deep into this. We won't go deep into this. But it says, the law is the only shadow of good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never be by the same sacrifices repeated year after year that make perfect those who draw near to worship. Otherwise, they would have never stopped being offered. For the worshipers would have been cleansed once and for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. This wasn't about, it wasn't about God needing us to do this. It didn't take away the sins of the world. It didn't take away the sins of the people. It wasn't for God. None of this was for God. This whole thing was for us. It was for God's people. It was for them to learn how to live in right relationship with each other. It was for them to learn the readiness for a Messiah that would be to come. It was for them to learn the recognition of a God who had been so good to them. It was for them to learn as slaves how to no longer live in the shame that they had been living in for so long. It was for them to learn those things. And that's why when God sees that they have sewn together fig leaves to try to cover their shame, Adam and Eve, what does he do? He shows up right after that in Genesis, and it says that he kills an animal. God kills an animal. The first time that blood and death and guts have ever been seen on this earth. And he murders an animal to cover what? Their sin and shame. He makes clothes for them to cover their sin and their shame. And for thousands of years, they will experience this as a way to cover their sin and shame, to kill an animal that will cover their sin and their shame. Until Jesus shows up, and Jesus shows up in John chapter 1, and John writes in John chapter 1, verse 14, that he became the Word, and the Word became flesh, and he uses that word, and he was the tent. That same tent, he tabernacled, is what John writes. He tabernacled among us, and we've seen his glory. And then when John the Baptist first sees Jesus, what does he refer to him as? He says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So that when Jesus goes through his sacrifice, he is on the cross and does exactly what that high priest did before and says, "It is finished." The sacrifice is over. It's been made. It is finished. And so for us today, we may not have sacrifices we bring into the temple. We don't come in with animals that you want me to wring their necks. You might have kids that you want me to do that with. But you don't come in with those things. You don't bring those sacrifices in. But we still live in a world where God is dwelling within us in a community and in a church that God says, "This is where I'm setting all things right again." And you have a different sacrifice to bring. And this is why Paul writes that famous verse in Romans chapter 12. "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." My hope is for us as followers of Jesus that we don't take those words lightly, that we are now the sacrifice that we bring. And here's the hard part about that, by the way, is if you put a living sacrifice, notice how it said in there, it wasn't a dead sacrifice, it wasn't an animal that's already been killed. You bring a living sacrifice, and here's the hard part about a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice is going to want to get up off that altar over and over again because it's alive. It's going to be like, "I don't want to be burned. I don't want to be murdered." It's going to try to get up off that altar every single day. You and I will try the same thing. But instead, allow us to stay there because what? This is an offering that is pleasing to God. So if you're walking in a place of shame, I want you to know that you're in a place of freedom. If you're walking wondering where you stand with God, I want you to know that he loves you, that he's with you. If you're wondering about any of these other things that get in our way, if you're in a place where you're trying to work so hard to please him, he's already pleased with you. He loves you. What you get to do is in response to him, to show him that you recognize him, that you're ready for him, and that you're living in righteousness with him and his people. Would you stand together as we pray this morning?